Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You.
And you thought we were done with the Beatles. I'm just kidding. We are done with the Beatles. We're done with the Beatles as a band. That doesn't mean that we're done with the individual members. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr all go on to have very successful careers after the Beatles break up in 1970. Paul, in particular, goes on to have one of the most successful careers of any band in the 1970s with his solo career, as well as with this second band he starts called Wings. Now, Wings is a band, but for all intents and purposes, it's Paul McCartney's solo project just called Wings. Now, just to put any suspicions to rest, no, the Beatles are never going to have a reunion tour. They're never going to do another album together, record more music together. For all I know, the Beatles are never even in the same room again once they split up in 1970, let alone making music together. But let's talk about what they do individually. All four of them immediately began solo careers in 1970 as soon as the band breaks up. Let's look at some of their most successful songs from the 1970s. In 1970, Paul McCartney, with his band Wings, releases the song Maybe I'm Amazed. In 1971, John Lennon releases the song Imagine, one of the most recognizable songs from the 1970s. In 1973, Ringo Starr releases It Don't Come Easy. In 1970, George Harrison releases My Sweet Lord. Some of the other biggest hits from the former Beatles include Band on the Run from 1973. That's a Paul McCartney song. And that song is interesting because very similar to the way Paul and John used to write music, where one of them would write part of a song and the other would write another part of the song, and they would just sort of push them together and combine it into one song. Band on the Run sounds like that, but it's all fragments that Paul wrote himself that were then put together. It almost sounds as though it's three different songs put together. Paul McCartney is also going to release the song Live and Let Die in 1973 for the James Bond film Live and Let Die. Paul, more so than any of the other Beatles, will continue to include these orchestral elements, which you can really hear on Live and Let Die. And the last song I'll share with you for now is John Lennon's song, Happy Xmas, War is Over. It's a Christmas song, specifically inspired by the events in Vietnam. We discussed how Positively 4th Street by Bob Dylan, the song that was a reaction to people who criticized him over going electric at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, is one of the earliest examples of a diss track, a song written almost as a retaliation to someone else or to express frustration or anger towards someone or calling someone out. In the first few years after the Beatles break up, John and Paul are not getting along, and many of their songs that they write are diss tracks toward one another. So as you're listening to this 1970s music from John and 1970s music from Paul, listen to that and see if you can pick on some of the moments where they're calling each other out. Looking back on music history, we can cite several concerts which were organized to raise money for something, a fundraising concert, such as Live Aid or Farm Aid. Well, the very first fundraising concert to feature A-list bands was from 1971. It was arranged by George Harrison and it's called The Concert for Bangladesh. The point of this concert was to raise funds to support Bangladesh in the wake of the Bangladesh Liberation War, specifically as a result of the genocide committed by Pakistan against the people of Bangladesh. I mentioned that the Beatles are never going to have a full reunion. You're never going to see all four band members in the same place at the same time, but we do get these mini reunions. The first one takes place during this concert and features George Harrison reuniting on stage with Ringo Starr, the first Beatles reunion. This concert also features Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Ravi Shankar. Ravi Shankar was the Indian classical musician who first mentored George Harrison. This song raises $12 million for the cause, which is equivalent to roughly $77 million today. After John Lennon's initial foray into the music business as a solo artist with the success of Imagine, he decides he's going to unofficially not retire from music, but step back from music, at least as this solo artist in the music industry, so to speak. So he and Yoko Ono moved to New York City to raise their young son together. They spent a lot of time in Greenwich Village, and what John Lennon and Yoko Ono really love about living in New York City during this time is people know them and people recognize them, of course, but it's not Beatlemania. It's not fans just chasing them all the time, screaming, wanting an autograph, wanting a picture. People just treat John Lennon like he's any other member of the community. They say hi, they're friendly, but there's no Beatlemania. And after all the hysteria of the last 10 years, that's really the only thing John Lennon wants. John Lennon is very vocal during this time, speaking out against the war in Vietnam. Between the peaceful message of Imagine, The peaceful anti-war sentiments of Happy Xmas War is Over, as well as a third song by John Lennon during this time period called Give Peace a Chance, he was actually convincing many Americans that maybe we shouldn't be in the war, maybe we're not benefiting anything from this, and it's purely political. Well, then President Richard Milhous Nixon sees the impact that John Lennon and Yoko Ono are having on the community and the way they're changing public perception of the war in Vietnam, and Nixon starts to think that John Lennon could cost him his re-election, so he unsuccessfully tries to have John Lennon deported back to England. Between 1975 and 1980, John Lennon really takes a step away from the music industry, but in 1980 he does return and releases the album Double Fantasy, November 17, 1980. Then, tragically, less than a month later, on December 8, 1980, John Lennon is murdered outside of his home in New York City. John Lennon is shot multiple times in the back by a young man named Mark David Chapman. John and Yoko were living in a building called the Dakota on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, across the street from Central Park. At approximately 5 p.m. on December 8, 1980, Mark David Chapman sees John Lennon and Yoko Ono leaving the Dakota, and he asks John for an autograph. John obliges, gets in his car, and he goes to the recording studio. At 10:50 p.m., John and Yoko return to their home, get out of their car, are walking toward the front door when Chapman says, "Mr. Lennon." John stops walking, but before he can turn around, he is shot several times in the back. Chapman sits on the ground and waits for police and an ambulance to arrive. John Lennon is rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, where he is pronounced dead on arrival. Mark David Chapman willingly is taken into police custody. As Chapman tells it, there were two contributing factors that led to his decision to murder John Lennon. The first were statements made by Lennon while he was still with the Beatles in 1966 that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. Now, what Lennon meant by this, if you listen to the full context of this TV interview, he wasn't saying that the Beatles are actually bigger than Jesus, or that they should be bigger than Jesus, but that more young people were interested in their music than were interested in religion at the time. He's not saying it's a good thing, that's how it should be. He was making an observation. If you look at footage of how excited people were, Beatlemania, to see the Beatles performed, how many people exercised that level of excitement for going to their house of worship? This quote was misconstrued even at the time when many people in the American South decided to get tractors and run over Beatles records. Unfortunately, too many people didn't take the time to really examine what John Lennon was saying in its original context. They just took the quote completely out of context. In addition to Mark David Chapman's anger over Lennon's remarks from 14 years earlier, he had also recently completed the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Chapman blames the book for leading him to murder John Lennon. 1 year later, in 1981, a man named John Hinckley Jr. is going to attempt to assassinate Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States. Ronald Reagan is shot and taken to a hospital, with Secret Servicemen fatally shot. John Hinckley Jr. will also blame The Catcher in the Rye for his inner need to murder Ronald Reagan, just as Mark David Chapman did for John Lennon. This event marks the first music assassination. It's not the first time a musician has been murdered, of course, but the other murders before this point were acts of passion, crimes of passion, completely unrelated to the music this person produced. Robert Johnson, the blues guitarist and singer, famous for Crossroads Blues in the 1920s in the Delta region of Mississippi, was murdered over a dispute of a woman. It had nothing to do with his music. It was a personal problem between him and another man. But John Lennon is assassinated because he is John Lennon. 3 surviving Beatles, and the rest of the world's hearts are absolutely broken and devastated by John's murder. But the main thing that the Beatles are grateful for is that in the few years leading up to John's murder, they were able to reconcile, set their differences aside, and they had actually gone back to being friends. They would call each other, they would talk, they were friendly. All of the problems and struggles that arose as a result of the high tensions during their last years of being the Beatles had faded away, and they were able to end things on good terms. From this point on, the world will only get to enjoy new music from Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr.